Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to be giving you a whole bunch of useful tips to get better at Elden Ring Nightreign, especially since the DLC has just released. We've got a ton of new relics, we've got some new passive weapon buffs and all these kinds of things, but this is going to feel like probably a lot of information, so feel free to come back to this video if you need to double check something or if you didn't understand, but I'm going to be giving you a lot of things that will help you get better as a player generally, some good game knowledge stuff, some character-specific stuff, and a whole bunch more. This is basically a massive compilation of a bunch of really interesting things and useful tips that I've learned over my hundreds of hours of Nightreign. So anyways, let's get into this. So first off is a very helpful tip in regards to troll enemies. Now, these are things that you're going to encounter pretty frequently in the castle. There could be several of them at once, or you might have to fight them down in caves if you're trying to get a purple smithing stone. But something to know is that they actually take a ton of stance damage from attacks that deal blood loss to them. So not only does proccing bleed just annihilate their health bar, but it also does additional stance damage, meaning you'll get more, critical hits and all that kind of stuff, and just big punish windows to completely rinse them. If you're playing a primarily melee-based character, it's absolutely worth farming these tombstones around Limvel to try to get a Wraith Calling Bell. I think this is one of the best items, especially if you're playing somebody like Undertaker, Wilder, even Iron Eye, just any kind of melee character that typically isn't using a ton of their FP, and you have that FP just laying around. This is a good way to have a projectile when you normally otherwise wouldn't. Next, any kind of seal with a blade incantation, something that buffs your weapon, upgrading it with a smithing stone will indeed scale the actual incantation on your weapon as well, so that's worth knowing. Speaking of blade incantations, you can actually cast Black Flame faster after an action than if you're just standing still from a neutral position. So, right, if you're just standing here, this is what it looks like, but if you do it out of a roll or out of a swing or something like that, you can cast it a little bit faster. In my opinion, one of the best ways to play Iron Eye is not with a bow really at all. I would change his dormant preference power to katanas and then use as many relics to stack arcane and then go for Rivers of Blood or something like that. With this build, you can pretty much make a better executor, and Iron Eye, I think, just gets a lot more mileage out of the actual melee weapons instead of his bow. It's nice to have, obviously, and there are some cool builds you can do with it, but I think melee Iron Eye and especially stacking on arcane is the way to go. You may have noticed that on some smaller to medium enemies, if you get a stance break, you can hit a critical from the front or the back side, but what you may not know is that doing a critical from the back actually deals less damage than if you hit it in the front. So what I'm saying is back shots are useless. If you get a stance break, you need to kind of come over to the front and get your critical then, if all possible. Next, do not sleep on treasure chest. There are some relics that allow you to spot treasure chests on your map. However, they do have a lot of fixed locations, but they're random each expedition. So there are, kind of static locations you can check, even if you don't have a relic that shows you where they are. But treasure chests can be so useful and very powerful for getting really good early game weapons. You can get purple weapons 30 seconds into the match, and potentially even the weapon that you want to bring into the Night Lord boss, meaning that you can spend a lot more time farming passives and otherwise just little buffs that will prepare you for the final night. But treasure chests, I think, are amazing and highly underrated. You can stack the Sword of Milos debuff with the Scepter of All-Knowing to give basically every single kind of resistance down to an enemy. Now, it is a sort of specific setup to have these two weapons at once, but you can basically nullify all of their resistances and just melt through a boss with literally anything at all. I will say the Scepter reduces magic and holy resistances, where the Sword of Milos does a lot of physical, so that is just something to keep in mind. There are a handful of unique passives that you can only acquire after defeating a nighttime boss during your expedition, and one of these passives is critical hits inflict blood loss. Now, this might sound, decent, but not always, build friendly or dependent, especially if you have a weapon that already has bleed. You might not think it useful to take this. However, if you have a weapon that doesn't deal bleed, this will obviously give you that ability, but taking this passive also just increases the base critical damage to begin with. So every time you hit a crit, regardless if you have a bleed weapon or not, you're going to be dealing more damage. And if you have a weapon that already deals bleed, it will make it even more likely likely to proc. So this is just one of the best player passives in the entire game, and I virtually never pass this one up. I think it's really powerful, even just for the, base increased critical damage. It's really great for that too. Now, something to keep in mind with the Rotted Woods Shifting Earth is that you can see these, scarlet rot bushes around the map that will clean the status effect from you. However, what you might not know is that you can hit these multiple times in a single bush, and it also restores your HP. So if you're caught in the rain or something and you want to just restore your health as you're running in, this is just useful to know. Even if you already have the Rotted Woods favor, you should definitely be picking these up. But speaking of the Rotted Woods favor, you will lose that if you're fighting the Dreglord inside of his boss fight, so there are other ways to stack that resistance, which we'll talk about a little bit later. For playing a character like Undertaker or Wilder or maybe even Raider, the Starfist / the Iron Ball have some of the best charge heavies in the entire game, and if you have a weapon passive that is damage negation on charge attacks, you should definitely combine these two, because this procs with any kind of charge attack, and with how good these ones are and how fast they come out, this is a very easy way to make sure that you pretty much always have some kind of damage negation, and they deal a absolute truckload of stance damage. You can stack the weapon passive that deals more attack power at full HP with the Ritual Sword Talisman that you can purchase from the Special Merchant either in Limfeld or in the new Shifting Earth, but these will combine with each other and give you a ton of extra power the entire time you're at full health. There is a player passive that includes attacks make enemies suddenly die occasionally, and weirdly enough, this actually works with Guardian's Shield Shockwave for what that's worth. So this next one can get a little bit complicated, but it's just something to take note of, is the fact that unique weapon skills will scale off of the weapon itself. However, non-unique weapon skills will scale off something entirely different. So, for example, a legendary weapon like Malekith's Black Blade will scale off of Faith. Obviously, will scale off the weapon itself. But non-unique weapon skills in the game, so things that can be applied to virtually any weapon or that you can apply to your starting weapon, will scale off of something specific. So for example, Hoarfrost Stomp is a really good early game one, and this scales off of intelligence and dexterity. And that I think is just worth mentioning because it means certain weapon skills will be more or less effective depending on your character's stats and scaling. In my opinion, the best use for the Radagon's Talisman that you can get in the game that extends the duration of spells is using it on weapon buffs and weapon incantations, because it makes them last significantly longer. If you're playing the new Undertaker character, it's worth noting a couple of things about her ultimate. Now, a lot of you probably know already how this works, but if you don't, you do get a normal ultimate charge just like any other Nightfarer, but if any sort of player in your game activates their ultimate, you get a free one to use indicated by this purple icon, and if you get a perfect dodge in any capacity from an enemy, you also get a temporary free ultimate, so you should always be using these if you do get a perfect dodge. But another thing to note, and it's really important, is that you will get iframes on the startup of your ultimate, but on the jump down when you're coming back, you actually don't have iframes, and this can get you into a lot of trouble. It's gotten me killed a handful of times, so it's just worth being a little bit tactical about where and when you use it, because if there's any kind of AoEs or another attack going to hit the ground at approximately the same time, you might get hit by it still. Listen, for all these struggling Guardian mains out there, Royal Knight's Resolve is one of the few weapon skills in the game that can actually buff his ultimate, which is very interesting. Next, we'll talk about the new Shifting Earth event very quickly, because a lot of players are struggling on this new map and are having a hard time sort of getting a route down and understanding what to do. The big entire event that you want to be focusing on is breaking these crystals, and I'm going to show you a map that has all of the crystal locations, but they can be randomized in your match. If you're playing solo, you need to break 3 of these crystals to shatter the Great Crystal, and if you're playing in a team, you need to shatter 4. But either way, once you've broken all of the crystals, you can come and get a passive that not only charges your ultimate slightly faster, but it also removes the curse, allowing you to enter these areas that take your HP to half. This should always be your priority in the new DLC, Shifting Earth. First and foremost is you should be removing that curse and then going after either these towers that have, boss rush stacks, and you can also use this to invade some of the castles with really good loot. Speaking of the new map, if you're a little bit confused on to where to get Wending Graces and just good shops, you have the normal merchant, obviously indicated by this icon, but you don't have the town merchant from Limveld, but what you do have is a special one indicated by this sparkling orange icon, and that is the equivalent of the town merchant that can randomly appear in the Limveld expedition. So this is essentially what you need to be looking for. If you're fighting any kind of enemies that live in death, any kind of skeletons, even deathbirds, always use shared order if you have it for, skeletons and these kinds of enemies, or if you have the inseparable sword, this prevents them from having to take another hit to be fully dead and prevents them from respawning. Sacred Order, on the other hand, is good, but it only buffs you, but the Golden Epitaph is twice as effective, and this is absolutely the weapon you want to use for any kind of enemies that live in death, or if you're struggling with deathbirds specifically, this might be what you want to go for. When you're looking at your relics, there is a magic attack power +4 in the game, and there is no stack limit to this. So if you have multiple of these and are playing into a magic-based character like, Recluse or Duchess, and if you're going for Shattering Crystal or something, you definitely want to make sure you're stacking these because there's virtually no limit to how powerful these can be. Now, some people may disagree with this, but in my opinion, the Duchess relic that gives you iframes when using the character skill is honestly not all that good, because instead of just focusing on, restaging big damage procs and all that stuff, you start to overthink it and try to use like iframes and use it as a dodge, but it's kind of weird because she already has a really good dodge. I just don't think it's a great relic, and some people might feel differently, but personally I think it's worth going into other things and just playing the restage as it's generally intended to multiply damage and maximize either yourself or your team's damage output. So in the brand new DLC expeditions, you can face against the Demon in Pain and the Demon from Below in Dark Souls 3. However, something that you'll definitely want to know is that in the first encounter that you fight these, always make sure to kill the Demon in Pain first, because after killing the Demon from Below, he'll basically absorb his power and then he'll fly away. And in day 2, you'll fight a different version depending on who you kill first. And always kill the Demon in Pain, because the demon will now do this giant laser attack that's very easy to avoid, and you can get a ton of damage in because this move lasts forever, and it's way easier to dodge than the meteors that the other demon can do. So just make sure to always kill the Demon in Pain first, regardless of anything else. If you and your team are having trouble beating Everdark Libra, the weapon passive that makes you less likely to be targeted is actually useful in there. Now, I honestly don't think this is one of the better weapon passives by any means, but in this specific case, it can be useful, as Libra can actually target the other NPCs that he'll spawn in more likely, and I think if your whole team has a couple of these, then it can be really effective. Now, when we're talking about resistances, and specifically the Dreglord, as he does a lot of Scarlet Rot, and that's actually one of the most dangerous parts about that fight, you want to make sure that you have as much resistance as possible. There's two things to consider here. Number one, if you're playing a Shifting Earth event like the Rotted Woods, then going after these item drops and eating these boluses that, obviously prevent Scarlet Rot buildup are good, but also getting passives from either Everjails or from enemies that have resistance to ailments is huge. You'll typically get a plus 57 resistance that adds just, 57 points to your bar, and the boluses you can consume for a permanent resistance, but it only adds 1. So it's not exactly super powerful, but it's not nothing either. If you eat a whole bunch of them, and that is stacked with the big resistance buff that maybe you got from an Everjail or something, then you should actually be able to stave off Scarlet Rot for the entire boss fight. But that goes for all of the other passives too. If you're eating a lot of these red ones, you can prevent blood loss buildup in Adele or something like that, but it gives you a permanent resistance, but only +1. So you need to kind of build a lot of them if you want anything meaningful out of it. Now, I've showed this tech off in a video before, but you can roll cancel your landings from any kind of large jump where you hit the ground and then sort of lose your sprint and hit this roll. Instead, if you jump off of a cliff and right when you hit the ground, you see the animation begin, if you reset your left stick to the neutral position while you're mid-animation, it will cancel it and allow you to immediately begin your sprint again. It might save you a handful of seconds, right? It's not the most powerful thing in the world, but it can be useful in those, moments where every second matters. In most cases, outside of a handful of unique scenarios, I think the passive that gives you better stamina recovery speed is always better than a flat stamina increase in virtually 99% of cases. Real quick, let's talk about some of the new DLC relics, how they work, and which ones I recommend. So, first and foremost, one of the best new relics ever in the entire game for almost any character is actually the one you get from Undertaker's Remembrance, and this is the glass necklace that gives you not only better, ultimate auto charging, but it gives you additional attack power on successive attacks. And again, this is useful for any Nightfarer period, but you can really get a lot of mileage out of this on Wilder, Undertaker, Duchess, Iron, anybody. There's also a new relic you get from defeating the Balancers that gives you 5% more flatline melee attack power and 20% more skill attack power, along with infinite FP recovery. Now, I will say the FP recovery is not a huge amount, but it can be enough to stall in boss fights and maybe get off some extra weapon skills and things like that. But 20% more skill attack power can be absolutely huge. And then lastly, the Dreglord's relic that gives you additional attack power when you have status effects on your screen. This one is really complicated to understand, but basically if you have status bars building throughout a couple of minutes, about 3 minutes or so, you can get up to 45% extra attack power, which is genuinely ridiculous. However, that comes with the caveat that it has to be on your screen and not procced, right? It needs to be building, and that's kind of difficult to sustain a constant status buildup without it either going away or proccing something on you. So this is very build dependent, but I will say that it has some interesting, very specific uses. Nightfarers like Executor might actually get a lot of mileage out of this relic, but I still don't think it's the most generally playstyle friendly one, but it can be very useful and extremely broken if used optimally. One of the most effective ways to play Undertaker, the new character, is to spam charged heavy R2s with hammers, because these deal lots of stance damage, and they have a, decent move set. Like, the move will come out relatively quickly, but you can get lots of stance breaks, and you can combine this with the weapon passive that is, enhanced charge attacks, and these are crazy together. There are relics in the game that killing more enemies fills more of the art gauge, and these relics are fantastic because it's actually a pretty significant buff to the overall charge rate of your ultimate. You only need 6 to 8 kills for most characters to completely recharge your ult, and this is a nice one to have, especially if you're a character that heavily relies on their ultimate. Now, there are lots of damage negation passives in the game, and yes, they do stack with each other if they are different rarities. So, for example, a damage negation at full HP on a blue weapon will stack with a damage negation at full HP on a purple weapon. Usually ones of the same color will not stack, and that's something to keep in mind. But the one that is improved damage negation at low HP, in my opinion, just humbly is very useless, especially in Deep of Night. It is absolutely just not a factor, because anything at low HP is sort of difficult to even trigger that window. You have to be fairly low, and also anything in Deep of Night when you're below 30% health, even just trash mobs will one-shot you. So in Deep of Night, don't ever run this passive. It can be moderately useful sometimes in the normal expeditions, but for the most part, I tend to avoid this one as I think it's the worst damage negation passive. Also, while we're on the topic, if you're playing Deep of Night, if you're in depths anywhere from 3 to 5, and if you're playing Limveld specifically, obviously one of the best meta relics is the Everjail relic, as this stacks attack power for each one you clear. However, what you may notice is that, especially in, depths 4 and 5, Everjails can take a long time. So alternatively, if you want to increase your attack power, there are relics that are, attack power increase when you kill Night Invaders, and these can be actually a bit more efficient sometimes than Everjails. It's definitely worth considering. It's build and Nightfarer dependent, but in case you're sick of farming giant tanky Everjail enemies, this can be a good alternative. If you're playing a character that relies on any kind of status or, proccing Frostbite or something like that, something to consider with Frost is that you can proc it on an enemy and then immediately remove it with a fire attack. This can be like Wilder's ultimate. This can be anything that deals fire damage will completely remove the status effect, and then you can try to re-proc it again for additional damage. So you can proc it, remove it with fire, and then do the same thing all over again. This is an extremely effective way to waste health bars, but it does obviously require you to have not only something that deals frost, but also fire as well. Having Dragon Wound Grease on your weapon in the Adele boss fight will actually make him drop your teammates if you're grabbed, and you can also, if you are playing Duchess, you get grabbed by this boss, you can actually restage inside of the bite itself, and if you deal enough damage, you can escape it. In the new map, if you're playing the boss rush towers and going through the different layers, all of them come with some kind of passive that helps you and the boss or hurts both of you, and one of these can be life draining, and this is really good because you can kind of just camp out the boss. You can get a couple of hits in and make sure you're just maintaining your own health, but the boss's health itself will eventually just drain out as long as you can survive. The teleporters inside the Great Hollow new map are the fastest way to get from one end of the map to the other because traversal in this can be quite tricky, but these teleporters are absolutely necessary. And lastly, the weapon passive successive attacks negate damage might single-handedly be the best passive in the whole game, and you can stack these with different weapons of multiple rarities. So if you combine a couple of these together and you get a couple of successive attacks, it's usually 3 to 4 depending on some conditions, you can pretty much have this procced at any given moment and always be taking less damage. This is great for characters that specifically swing quickly as well. But other than having damage negation at full HP, this is probably the most important one, regardless of any circumstance, whatever Night Lord you're facing, that you always want to be going after. Well, you may have noticed when you're playing Limveld after the DLC, there are these new encampments, and these actually have bosses that can be found underground. So if you're playing in the shaded castle, you need to kind of go underneath to face the boss in this area. But also what you may see is that there are these forges, and you can actually re-roll a weapon skill over here. Unfortunately, it does not re-roll the weapon passive, which could be even more useful, but if you have a weapon and you just don't care for the skill on it, you can grab the fire somewhere located in the encampment, bring it back to the forge, and then re-roll it for a different random one. But sometimes the flame you need to actually take it to the forge can be found in different spots, so it's worth playing these a couple of times to get familiar with all of the locations. If you get Libra to give you the demon plating, meaning he takes away half your health, but you pay him off, and then now you get increased attack power for the number of runes you have, it's definitely worth taking the Symbol of Avarice to farm even more runes, just thus increasing your attack power. However, if you do get a passive in the game that you can ask him for, that is Eventual Greatness, I would always recommend taking this as well, because after the next successive night that you complete, you'll be given a ton more HP, stamina, and FP. This is really good to use. Also worth mentioning, if you're playing an expedition that has Mohg as the Night Lord and you have Libra inside your map as an event, you can ask him for a way to cleanse the curse, and he will give you the Purifying Crystal Tear, which will prevent Mohg's ability of him just basically taking everyone's blood and, restoring his HP from happening. Or he'll still do the move, but it won't take your health away. Now, there are a lot of ways to get around this move, to be honest. Like, if you know what you're doing, you can melt Mohg before he even gets through that entire move itself. So while it is by no means necessary to get the Purifying Crystal Tear every time you fight Mohg in this context, it is just something nice to know in case you're not confident enough that you can shut down that phase quickly before he takes all of you and your team's health away. So either way, but anyways, guys, just wanted to give you a bunch of helpful tips to get better at Nightreign, and I hope you learned something from this video, and if you did, just leave a like and make sure to subscribe to the channel. I would love to hit 1 million one day, but thank you guys so much for spending your time watching this, and I'll see you in the next one.